Now we arrive at a fascinating philosophical puzzle. Why must the first cause be personal? Frank Turek presents what's often called the starting gun problem, and it's a powerful argument. But let's deepen it philosophically and theologically to make it even more compelling. The question is this: if the cause of the universe is timeless and eternal, why did the universe begin at a particular moment in time rather than existing eternally? What triggered the beginning? This is the starting gun problem. Something must account for why an eternal cause produces a temporal effect. Let's examine this carefully. First, the setup. We've established that the first cause must be timeless, existing outside temporal succession. Time itself began with the universe, so whatever caused the universe cannot be temporal. It must be eternal in the sense of being atemporal, not everlasting. Now, if this timeless cause were impersonal, like a mechanical force or natural law, and if the conditions for producing the universe were present from eternity, then why isn't the universe also eternal? Impersonal causes, operating under unchanging conditions, produce their effects necessarily and timelessly. For example, if water is below 0 degrees Celsius, it freezes. The cause, cold temperature, and the effect, freezing, are simultaneous and necessary given the conditions. There's no delay, no choice, no deliberation. If an impersonal, timeless cause had the conditions to create the universe from eternity, the universe would be eternal too. But the universe isn't eternal, it began. The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, the second law of thermodynamics, and Big Bang cosmology all converge on this conclusion. So how do we explain a timeless cause producing a temporal effect? The answer: the cause must be personal, possessing will and agency. A personal agent can freely choose to act even from a state of timelessness, bringing about a temporal effect. Think of an analogy. A person can sit still for an extended time and then freely choose to stand up. The person's existence is prior to the action, but the action occurs at a particular moment by choice, not necessity. Similarly, God can exist timelessly and then freely choose to create the universe at a particular moment, or more precisely, create time itself along with the universe.
Let's address several key objections and strengthen the argument further. Objection 1 is about the timelessness of choice. How can a timeless being make a choice when it involves deliberation over time, considering options, weighing reasons, then deciding? This presumes all choices require temporal deliberation, which may not be true. A timeless being can have an eternal will to create at a specific moment from the perspective of time. God's will is eternally settled, and the effect is temporal. Augustine wisely observed, "It is not in time that God precedes time, otherwise he would not precede all times. He precedes all past times in the sublimity of an ever-present eternity." God's act of creation is an eternal act with the beginning of time as its effect. Objection 2. Why did God create when he did instead of earlier or later? This question is meaningless because it assumes time existed prior to creation. Time is a creation itself. Asking why God didn't create earlier is akin to asking what's north of the North Pole, a category error. Proper understanding reveals that time commences with creation. Objection 3 posits personal agents are embodied and temporal. They evolved within the universe. How can God be personal without a body or existing in time? This confusion stems from conflating human personhood with personhood in general. Personhood essentially involves consciousness, intention, rationality, and will, not strictly embodiment or temporality. God embodies personal attributes as a conscious, rational agent capable of intentional action distinct from human limitations. Objection 4 suggests, couldn't the quantum vacuum or another impersonal physical state serve as the timeless cause? No, because the quantum vacuum isn't nothing, it's a physical state with properties, laws, and exists within space-time or a proto-space-time. it's neither timeless nor non-physical. Quantum fluctuations occur within time, not timelessly, and fail to explain why there's a quantum vacuum rather than absolute nothingness.
To provide a richer understanding of God's timeless personhood and creative act, we first integrate the doctrine of divine simplicity and immutability. In classical theology, God doesn't change when he creates. His eternal will to create is unchanging. What changes is the creature. The universe begins to exist. This avoids the problem of God transitioning from not creating to creating, which would imply change in God. Aquinas explained this using the analogy of a pillar and a shadow. When a pillar is first placed in sunlight, the shadow appears. From the shadow's perspective, something new began. But the pillar didn't change. It was always capable of casting a shadow. Similarly, creation is new from the universe's perspective, but God's eternal will to create doesn't change. Second, emphasize the Trinitarian nature of God's personhood. God is not a solitary, lonely person who needed to create for companionship or fulfillment. God is eternally triune, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in perfect relational communion. Love, communication, and relationship exist within God's own being from eternity. This grounds personhood in God's nature, not in temporal existence or external relationships. God creates not from need, but from the overflow of his goodness and love. The Trinity also resolves potential problems about God being personal in isolation. Personhood doesn't require others outside oneself if relational communion exists within the Godhead. The three persons of the Trinity are eternally personal in relation to each other. Third, engage Augustine and Boethius on divine eternity. Augustine taught that God exists in the eternal present. He doesn't experience past, present, and future sequentially, but sees all of time in one eternal now. Boethius divine eternity as the complete possession all at once of illimitable life. God doesn't endure through time, he transcends it. From this perspective, God's creative act is eternally present to him, but its effect, the universe, is temporal from our perspective within time. Fourth, connect this to the biblical language of God's sovereign will. Scripture repeatedly affirms that God does all he pleases and accomplishes his purposes according to the counsel of his will. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11, he works all things according to the counsel of his will. This biblical emphasis on divine sovereignty and intentionality supports the philosophical argument that the first cause must be a willing agent, not an impersonal mechanism. Now, Turek must avoid certain logical pitfalls. First, don't overstate the analogy of human choice. God's choice to create is not like human deliberation. It's an eternal, simple act of will. The analogy helps us understand the concept of free agency, but we must acknowledge the significant disanalogy between divine and human willing. Second, avoid implying that God is temporal or changes. Creation involves change in the creature, not the creator. God's relationship to time is unique. He's the author of time, not subject to it. Third, clarify that personal doesn't mean anthropomorphic. We're not claiming God is a big human in the sky. We're affirming that the ultimate reality is more like mind than matter, more like agent than mechanism. In summary, the starting gun problem demonstrates that a timeless impersonal cause cannot produce a temporal effect, because impersonal causes operating under unchanging conditions produce effects necessarily and simultaneously. Only a personal cause, a willing conscious agent, can freely choose to bring about a temporal effect from a state of timelessness. This argument powerfully supports theism over impersonal cosmological theories. Christian theology enriches this by explaining God's timeless personhood through divine simplicity, Trinitarian relations, and the concept of eternal will producing temporal effects. Turek should engage objections about choice requiring time, address misconceptions about personhood, integrate Augustine and the Trinity, and avoid anthropomorphizing God. This makes the argument for a personal creator philosophically rigorous and theologically profound. Next, we'll turn to slide 13, where we'll examine why science itself fundamentally depends on the principle of causality, and why abandoning causality to avoid God actually undermines the scientific enterprise that atheists often champion.
Let's examine why science fundamentally depends on causality and how Frank Turek can strengthen this crucial argument. The slide states that science seeks causes to explain effects. This is absolutely correct, but we must go deeper philosophically. Here's the central claim. Without causality, the scientific method collapses entirely. But Turek needs to address David Hume's devastating challenge head-on. Hume argued we never actually observe causation, we only observe constant conjunction. We see billiard ball A strike ball B and B moves, but do we truly see the causing or merely one event following another? This is the problem of induction. Turek's response should be twofold. First, the pragmatic argument. Science works spectacularly. We've built civilization on causal reasoning. Medicine, engineering, technology all depend on it. If causality were illusory, this success would be an inexplicable cosmic fluke. But there's a stronger transcendental argument available. Causality isn't merely observed, it's a necessary precondition for making sense of experience at all. Without assuming causal relationships, we cannot distinguish between genuine patterns and random coincidences. We cannot formulate testable hypotheses. We cannot even conceive of laws of nature. Causality is transcendentally necessary for science. Now here's where Turek must bring in theism's explanatory advantage. Atheistic naturalism offers no account for why the universe should be causally ordered rather than chaotic. It simply assumes regularity. Theism, by contrast, explains it. A rational creator sustains creation in orderly patterns. This is the doctrine of divine providence and continuous creation, creatio continua. God doesn't just wind up the universe and walk away. He actively upholds the causal structure moment by moment. Consider Colossians chapter 1, verse 17. In him, all things hold together. The biblical worldview predicts a causally ordered cosmos because it reflects the logos, the divine reason and order. Turek should also address the deeper inconsistency in atheists' objections. When atheists deny causality for the universe's origin, claiming quantum fluctuations or multiverses exempt the cosmos from needing a cause, they're sawing off the branch they're sitting on. If causality can be abandoned when convenient, why trust it anywhere? Why trust the scientific reasoning that led to quantum mechanics in the first place? This is performative contradiction. They use causal reasoning to argue against causal reasoning. Finally, Turek must clarify the relationship between methodological naturalism and metaphysical naturalism. Science legitimately brackets supernatural explanations for practical research. That's methodological naturalism, and it's perfectly fine. But methodological limits don't prove metaphysical conclusions. Just because a metal detector only finds metal doesn't mean diamonds don't exist. Confusing the method's limits with reality's limits is a category error. So the strengthened argument runs like this. Science presupposes causality. Causality requires a metaphysical foundation, either brute assumption or rational grounding. Atheism offers only brute assumption. Theism offers rational grounding in the nature of a creator who is himself the logos, the principle of rationality and order. Therefore, science is more coherent on theism than atheism. And here's the kicker. Every time an atheist does science, they're borrowing capital from the theistic worldview. They're assuming order, rationality, and causality, the very things their worldview cannot account for, but Christianity predicts and explains.
Now we must address the most common objections to the causal principle, where Frank Turek needs to be exceptionally rigorous. The quantum mechanics objection is frequently mentioned. Quantum events are uncaused. Particles pop into existence without causes all the time. Precision is crucial here. First, Turek must distinguish between indeterministic and uncaused. Quantum mechanics shows certain events are probabilistically indeterministic. We cannot predict exactly when a radioactive atom will decay. However, indeterministic is not the same as uncaused. The atom's decay occurs within a quantum field, governed by quantum mechanical laws with specific initial conditions and boundary parameters, indicating significant ontological structure. The quantum vacuum is not nothing. It's the lowest energy state of a quantum field buzzing with virtual particles, borrowing energy within Heisenberg's uncertainty principle's constraints. These fluctuations require existing quantum fields, space-time, physical laws, and mathematical structures, meaning there's something present, not nothing. Physicist David Albert critiqued Lawrence Krauss, stating, "The fact that particles can pop in and out of existence as those fields rearrange themselves is no more mysterious than the fact that fists can appear and disappear as my fingers rearrange. The quantum field is something, not nothing." Here, Turek should integrate the distinction between primary and secondary causation from Thomistic philosophy. God is the primary cause, the ultimate ground of existence. Secondary causes are mechanisms within creation, like quantum fields and natural laws. Quantum indeterminacy operates at the secondary level but doesn't eliminate the need for primary causation. The entire quantum mechanical framework itself requires explanation. Why do these laws exist? Why this mathematical structure instead of another, or none at all? The second objection, if everything needs a cause, what caused God, reveals a fundamental misunderstanding. The causal principle states whatever begins to exist has a cause, not that everything whatsoever needs a cause. Things that begin to exist are contingent. They depend on something else for existence. Their non-existence is possible, whereas God in classical theism is not contingent. He is a necessary being. His non-existence is impossible. He is being itself, ipsum esse subsistens in Aquinas' terms. Asking what caused God is a category error, like asking what is the color of jealousy. You're applying causation of contingent beings to something outside that category, a necessary being. Here is the essential clarification Turek must make. The universe is contingent. Its constants, laws, and initial conditions could have been different. There's nothing about the universe necessitating its own existence. It's radically contingent. God, in contrast, is the one being whose essence is existence, who cannot not exist, and is self-existent, or ase. This isn't special pleading, merely recognizing fundamentally different categories of being. If you claim everything needs a cause, without exception, you generate an infinite regress, explaining nothing. You must posit something that stops this regress, either a brute fact universe or a necessary God. Theism argues the universe is contingent, therefore unsuitable for stopping the regress, whereas a necessary being, one that exists by metaphysical necessity, is a philosophically coherent ultimate explanation. The third objection. Couldn't the universe be necessary rather than contingent? No, because the universe exhibits all marks of contingency. Its laws could vary, different gravitational constants, electron charges. Its initial conditions could differ, matter and energy distributions. Its very existence depends on finely tuned parameters. Nothing about the universe screams, "I must exist," like a necessary being. Furthermore, the universe began to exist, as demonstrated by the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. Necessary beings don't begin. They exist in all possible worlds. The universe exists in some possible worlds, indicating contingency. Lastly, the God of the gaps accusation. You're using God as a filler for scientific unknowns. The response is that the argument is based on positive knowledge. We know the universe is contingent, and contingent things require explanation. We know the universe began. We know whatever caused space-time can't be made of space-time. These are positive metaphysical conclusions, not arguments from ignorance. The reverse is true. Atheism here relies on a materialism of the gaps, hoping future materialistic explanations will somehow account for existence, despite the category error in asking material processes to explain material reality's existence. To strengthen Turek's response, quantum mechanics doesn't provide uncaused events, it provides indeterministic secondary causes within an existing framework requiring ultimate explanation. The causal principle applies to contingent beings that begin to exist, not to necessary beings. The universe is demonstrably contingent, not necessary. The theistic explanation is based on positive metaphysical reasoning, not ignorance. Properly understood, these objections reinforce rather than undermine the cosmological argument.
As we conclude Chapter 1 on causality, let's synthesize what Frank Turek has argued and identify where his case can be strengthened philosophically and theologically. First, the core takeaway. The universe began and needs a cause beyond space-time. This is solid ground. The Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, second law of thermodynamics, and Big Bang cosmology converge on a beginning. But Turek must emphasize that even if the universe were eternal, it would still require explanation. Eternal doesn't mean necessary. The universe remains contingent. Its laws, constants, and structure could have been otherwise. This is where Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason becomes indispensable. Why does anything exist at all? Why this universe rather than another or none? Contingent reality demands a sufficient reason, and only a necessary being provides that without generating infinite regress. Second, the first cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, and personal. Turek's reasoning here is generally sound, but he needs greater precision on what timeless means. It's not sempiternal, existing at all moments of time, but rather atemporal, outside temporal succession entirely. This is Boethius's concept of eternity. God experiences all of time in a simultaneous eternal now, not a stretched-out temporal line. This resolves apparent contradictions about how a timeless being can create temporal effects. Augustine's insight is crucial. God doesn't act before creation because time itself is created. God's creative act is eternal, but its effect, the universe, is temporal. This is ontological causation, not temporal causation. The cause is logically and metaphysically prior, not temporally prior. Turek should make this distinction crystal clear. Third, science itself depends on causality. This is perhaps Turek's strongest philosophical move. If skeptics abandon causal reasoning to avoid God, they undermine the very rationality of science. But here's where Turek must go deeper. Why is the universe causally ordered at all? Atheism has no answer, it's just brute fact. Theism, by contrast, predicts and explains it. A rational creator would fashion a rationally ordered cosmos. This isn't circular reasoning, it's inference to the best explanation. The theistic worldview offers superior explanatory scope and coherence. Now let's identify areas for strengthening using orthodox theology. First, integrate divine simplicity more thoroughly. God is not a complex being with parts, body, mind, will, operating separately. In classical theism, particularly Thomistic philosophy, God is ipsum esse subsistens, being itself. His essence is his existence. His attributes are not added qualities, but unified in his simple divine nature. This resolves the "what caused God" objection definitively. The question commits a category error. Causation applies to composite contingent beings whose existence is distinct from their essence. God has no such composition. He is pure actuality with no potentiality requiring actualization. Therefore, he cannot be caused. Second, emphasize creatio ex nihilo as central Christian doctrine. This isn't merely philosophical speculation, it's revealed truth confirmed by reason. Genesis chapter 1, John chapter 1, Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3, Scripture consistently affirms God created not from pre-existing material, but from nothing. This doctrine wasn't obvious to ancient Greeks. Plato and Aristotle assumed eternal matter. Christianity introduced the radical concept that God freely chose to create everything that isn't himself. Matter, energy, space, time, all are contingent gifts of divine will. Third, integrate logos theology more robustly. Causality isn't just a philosophical principle we happen to observe.
It reflects the Logos, the divine reason through whom all things were made, as John chapter 1 declares. Colossians chapter 1 verse 17, "In him all things hold together." The universe's causal structure is upheld moment by God's active sustenance, what classical theology calls creatio continua. This isn't deism, a divine watchmaker who winds the clock and walks away. It's continuous divine conservation. Every causal interaction depends on God's active sustenance. Now let's address logical fallacies Turek must avoid. First, begging the question. He can't simply assert God exists and then use that to explain causality. He must argue from universally accepted premises like whatever begins to exist has a cause, and deduce God's existence as the conclusion. The argument must be structured so skeptics can follow the logical steps even if they resist to conclusion. Second, avoid composition fallacy more explicitly. Just because things within the universe have causes doesn't automatically mean the universe as a whole has a cause. Turek must argue that the universe itself is a contingent composite entity that began to exist, therefore falling under the causal principle. Its contingency is demonstrated by its dependence on specific laws, constants, and initial conditions. Third, address special pleading head-on. When Turek claims God doesn't need a cause, skeptics cry foul. The response? The causal principle is properly formulated as applying to contingent beings that begin to exist. God, as a necessary being who doesn't begin, isn't exempted arbitrarily, but falls outside the principle's scope by definition. This isn't special pleading, it's categorical precision. Fourth, avoid false dilemma. The choice isn't merely eternal universe or God. There are other proposals: multiverse, quantum vacuum fluctuations, cyclical models. Turek must address these systematically, showing why each still requires ultimate explanation and why theism remains the most coherent foundation. Now let's emphasize what makes Christianity's case particularly strong. It's not just generic theism, but the Christian doctrine of the Trinity that best explains personhood in God. How can a timeless, solitary being be personal? Personhood requires relationship, and relationship seems to require time. But the Trinity resolves this beautifully. God is eternally relational within Himself, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in perfect communion. Personhood doesn't depend on temporal sequence or external relationships. God is love eternally, not merely loving after creating creatures to love. In summary, Turek's causality argument is fundamentally sound but can be significantly strengthened. Ground it more explicitly in the principle of sufficient reason. Clarify timelessness using classical theology. Integrate divine simplicity to defeat the "who caused God" objection. Emphasize creatio ex nihilo and logos theology for deeper biblical grounding. Avoid logical fallacies through precise formulation. And show how Trinitarian theology offers the richest account of a personal first cause. These enhancements move from good apologetics to philosophically rigorous, theologically deep, and logically unassailable argumentation. That's the standard we should aim for when defending the faith.
Welcome to Chapter 2, Reason. This is where Frank Turek's argument becomes particularly fascinating because it targets the very foundation of rational discourse itself. His central claim is this: if atheistic materialism is true, then arguments themselves lose credibility. Just consider the implications. Not merely saying atheism is wrong, but that atheism undermines the very reasoning process for arguing itself. A devastating critique if sustainable. Let's delve into Turek's case and how he might strengthen it philosophically and theologically. First, the core problem. Atheistic materialism posits only physical matter and energy exist. Concepts like minds, thoughts, beliefs, and arguments are reduced to mere brain states, the physical arrangements of neurons firing following physical laws. No immaterial soul, no transcendent rationality, just molecules in motion. Here lies the dilemma. If thoughts result purely from physical causes, determined biochemical reactions, why trust them as rational? They're not arising because they track truth, but because physics dictated them. This is the argument from reason, powerfully articulated by C.S. Lewis in Miracles. Lewis argues that naturalism fails to account for rationality because irrational processes can't produce truth-tracking thoughts, undermining belief in naturalism itself. Turek needs to make this argument more explicit. Engagingly, here's the strengthening strategy. Distinguish causes, physical events producing effects, and reasons, logical grounds justifying belief. Materialism explains causes, but not reasons. It clarifies why I hold beliefs in terms of chemistry, but not if I should hold them or if they're true. Crucial distinctions. Reasoning as mere neuron firing makes logical necessity between premises and conclusion not logical at all, but mere causation, which is truth agnostic. Secondly, engage Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument more thoroughly. Cognitive faculties from unguided evolutionary processes selected for survival, not truth, gives a defeater for their reliability. Evolution favors survival over truth, so naturalism has no grounds to trust cognitive outputs, undermining itself as self-defeating. Third, Turek must clarify logical laws' nature. Laws of logic, immaterial, universal, unchanging truths, not physical. The question becomes, what grounds them? If only matter exists, their origin is inexplicable. But they're not conventions, as they're discovered, not invented, or evolutionary adaptations, since their truth is independent of existence. Theism coherently explains them. They reflect God's rational nature. God as logos, divine reason. Logic flows from his nature. Hence, universal rational order and minds, made in God's image, apprehend this order. This is the Logos doctrine. Christ is divine reason through whom all is made, metaphysical grounding for rationality itself. Turek must avoid the genetic fallacy. Just because materialism fails to explain reason doesn't prove theism. He must argue theism offers the best explanation, an inference to the best explanation. Theism predicts rational minds and immaterial laws. Atheism fails. Avoid overstating. Atheists obviously reason they're rational due to God's image, unintentionally borrowing from the theistic worldview. Engage naturalists claiming evolution produces reliable faculties by noting direct survival necessary, but abstract thought, mathematics, philosophy aren't directly survival relevant. Evolution offers no grounds for trust in these faculties. An unreliable domain undermines trust completely. Finally, integrate Orthodox Christian theology deeply. Imago Dei explains rational souls capable of abstract thought and immaterial truths, where souls not merely material. Augustine's divine illumination, we see truth because God enlightens us. Aquinas' intellect, immaterial, distinct, grasping universals. Classical anthropology, supporting rational faculty. In summary, Chapter 2's reason presents a powerful argument. Reason needs grounding materialism lacks, but theism provides. To strengthen, distinguish causes from reasons, rigorously engage Plantinga, clarify immaterial laws, ground in Logos doctrine, avoid logical fallacies, and integrate classical anthropology. transforming a compelling argument into one devastating to naturalism. Next, slide 17 awaits, exploring reason's nature and logic's role.
Let's explore what reason actually is and why it matters so profoundly. Frank Turek defines reason as using the laws of logic to form true beliefs from evidence. That's a good working definition, but we must unpack it more carefully to strengthen the philosophical foundation. First, what are the laws of logic? Turek mentions three core principles: the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, and the law of excluded middle. Let's examine each and their metaphysical implications. The law of non-contradiction states that contradictory statements cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense. Something cannot be both A and not A simultaneously. For example, the statement, "it is raining," and "it is not raining," cannot both be true at the same moment in the same location. This seems obvious, yet it's foundational. Without this principle, language becomes meaningless, arguments collapse, and reality becomes incoherent. The law of identity states that each thing is identical with itself. A is A. This might sound trivial, but it's crucial. It establishes that things have stable natures and properties. A dog is a dog, not sometimes a dog and sometimes a cat. This grounds our ability to refer to objects consistently and reason about their properties. The law of excluded middle states that for any proposition, either that proposition is true or its negation is true. There's no third option. Either it's raining or it's not raining. There's no middle state. Now, some logical systems challenge this in specific contexts, particularly in quantum mechanics or fuzzy logic, but for ordinary discourse about truth claims, this principle holds. Here's where Turek must be more explicit. These laws are not physical entities. They don't exist in space or time. They're not made of matter or energy. They can't be measured, weighed, or observed through scientific instruments. Yet, they're universally binding. They apply to all reasoning, everywhere, always. They were true before humans existed and would remain true even if all minds ceased. This raises a devastating question for materialism. If only physical things exist, how can immaterial logical laws exist? And how can they be universal, necessary, and unchanging? Materialists have no satisfactory answer. Some suggest they're conventions, human inventions like traffic laws. But that fails immediately. We don't decide the law of non-contradiction by vote or cultural agreement. We discover it. It governs our thinking whether we acknowledge it or not. Violating it doesn't change the law. It produces incoherence. Others suggest they're descriptions of how brains work, neural patterns that evolved for survival. But this also fails. The laws of logic apply to propositions about reality, not just to brain states. They were true about the universe long before brains evolved, and they apply to abstract domains, mathematics, theology, philosophy, far removed from survival pressures. Turek should explicitly argue that the laws of logic require a grounding in a necessarily existing rational mind, namely God. They reflect the divine nature. God doesn't obey logic as though it's external to him. Rather, logic flows from his rational essence. This is what classical theology means when it calls God logos, the eternal reason. Now, let's address reason as a faculty. Reason is the human ability to apprehend truth through logical inference and evidence. It's not merely computation. Algorithms don't reason in the full sense. Reason involves understanding meaning, grasping universal truths, recognizing logical relationships, and judging evidence. This requires consciousness, intentionality, and abstraction, capacities that materialism cannot adequately explain.
Continuing our exploration of what reason is, here's where Turek must engage the argument from reason more rigorously, especially C.S. Lewis's formulation. Lewis distinguished between cause and reason. A cause is a physical event producing an effect, like neurochemical reactions causing a belief state. A reason is a logical justification for holding a belief, evidence and inference showing why the belief is true or rational. Now, if all mental events are merely physical causes, neurons firing according to chemistry and physics, then our beliefs aren't formed because they're true, but because prior physical states determined them. This severs the connection between belief and truth. We'd have no grounds for trusting our reasoning, including the reasoning that led to materialism. The theory undercuts itself. Turek should make this crystal clear. Materialism explains why we believe, but not whether we should believe. It accounts for psychological causation, but not rational justification. And without rational justification, all arguments, including arguments for materialism, lose credibility. Furthermore, Turek must clarify the distinction between reasoning and computational processing. Computers perform calculations, but they don't understand meaning. They manipulate symbols according to programmed rules without grasping what those symbols represent. Human reason, by contrast, involves semantic understanding. We grasp what propositions mean and recognize their truth or falsehood. This semantic dimension, this aboutness or intentionality, is precisely what materialism struggles to explain. Physical processes are just causal chains. They don't carry inherent meaning. Now, where can Turek strengthen this with Christian Orthodox theology? First, emphasize that humans are made in God's image, imago Dei. This means we share, in finite form, God's rationality. We're designed to think God's thoughts after Him, to apprehend truth because God is truth. Our minds are meant to correspond with reality because the same Logos who made reality also made our minds. Second, integrate Augustine's doctrine of divine illumination. Augustine argued that we see eternal truths, like mathematical principles and logical laws, through a kind of intellectual light provided by God. Just as physical light makes visible objects perceptible, divine illumination makes intelligible truths accessible to our minds. We don't create these truths, we discover them by participating in God's eternal knowledge. Third, engage Aquinas' philosophy of the intellect. Aquinas distinguished between the material imagination, tied to brain processes, and the immaterial intellect, which grasps universal concepts and necessary truths. The intellect abstracts universals from particular experiences. For example, you've seen many triangles, but you understand triangularity itself, a universal concept not reducible to any particular physical triangle or brain state. This intellectual abstraction is an immaterial operation, Aquinas argued, demonstrating that the human soul has immaterial capacities. Now, let's address logical fallacies Turek must avoid. First, don't commit the genetic fallacy. Turek shouldn't merely argue that materialism can't explain reason and therefore theism wins by default. He must also show positively that theism predicts and explains reason. Theism offers a coherent account. Immaterial logical laws exist because they reflect God's nature, and rational minds exist because they're created in His image. Second, avoid overstating the conclusion. The argument from reason establishes generic theism, a rational creator, not specifically Christianity. Christianity provides the fullest explanation through the Logos doctrine, but Turek should acknowledge that this particular argument alone doesn't prove Christian theology in all its specifics. Third, engage counter-arguments seriously. Some materialists, like Daniel Dennett, argue that reason can emerge from non-rational processes through evolution, much like design can emerge from natural selection. Turek's response should be that evolution might explain computational abilities, but not semantic understanding, normative rationality, or the reliability of reasoning about abstract matters unrelated to survival. In summary, reason involves using immaterial, universal, necessary laws of logic to form true beliefs. Materialism cannot account for these laws' existence or for the human capacity to grasp them. Theism, grounded in the Logos doctrine, provides a coherent explanation. Logic reflects God's nature, and human reason reflects our creation in his image. Turek should distinguish causes from reasons, engage C.S. Lewis rigorously, integrate Augustine and Aquinas, and argue positively for theism's explanatory power. These enhancements make the argument from reason devastatingly effective against naturalism. Next, we'll turn to slide 18, where we'll examine more deeply why the laws of logic are real, yet immaterial, and what that implies for competing worldviews.
Now, we arrive at a pivotal question. The laws of logic are real and immaterial. But what does this actually mean, and why does it create such a profound problem for materialism? Frank Turek rightly emphasizes that logical laws are foundational to all reasoning, but let's deepen this argument philosophically and theologically. First, what does it mean to say the laws of logic are real? They're not merely subjective preferences or cultural conventions. They are objective. They would be true regardless of whether anyone believed them. The law of non-contradiction held true before humans evolved and would remain true even if all conscious beings ceased to exist. They are discovered, not invented. When we say A cannot be both A and not A simultaneously, we're articulating a truth about reality itself, not creating a rule by consensus. Second, what does it mean to say they're immaterial? This is crucial. The laws of logic have no physical properties whatsoever. You cannot place the law of non-contradiction on a scale and weigh it. You cannot measure its length with a ruler. It doesn't occupy space. It doesn't consume energy. It exists outside the physical universe entirely. Yet it governs all rational thought within the universe. This creates an immediate and devastating challenge for materialism. If only physical, material things exist, if reality consists solely of matter and energy arranged in space-time, then how can immaterial, logical laws exist? And not just exist, but be universal, necessary, and binding on all reasoning. Turek needs to press this objection more forcefully. Here's the dilemma for the materialist. Option 1, deny that logical laws are real. But this leads to intellectual suicide. If the law of non-contradiction isn't real, then contradictions can be true. But if contradictions can be true, then literally anything follows. All arguments collapse, including arguments for materialism. This position is rationally untenable. Option 2. Claim logical laws are just descriptions of how brains work, patterns of neural firing that evolved for survival. But this fails on multiple grounds. First, logical laws apply universally, not just to human brains. They governed reality before brains evolved. They apply to mathematics, to propositions about abstract objects, to counterfactual reasoning, domains far removed from evolutionary pressures. Option 3, accept that immaterial realities exist alongside material ones, making materialism false. This is the honest conclusion, but it's devastating to the materialist worldview. If immaterial logical laws exist, then materialism, the claim that only matter exists, is demonstrably false.
Now, here's where Turek should bring in Platonism and its problems for atheism. Plato argued that abstract objects, forms, numbers, logical laws exist in a realm of eternal, unchanging reality. But this raises the question, what is the relationship between this abstract realm and the physical world? Why do physical objects instantiate mathematical properties? Why does the universe obey logical laws? Platonism offers no answer. It simply posits two separate realms with no explanation for their correspondence. Theism, by contrast, provides a coherent answer. The laws of logic exist in the mind of God. They reflect his rational nature. God is logos, eternal reason. Logic isn't something external that God obeys, it's intrinsic to his essence. And because God created both the physical universe and rational minds, there's a built-in correspondence. The universe is rational because a rational creator made it. Our minds can grasp logic because they're made in the image of the Logos. This is the Christian solution to Plato's problem. Turek should also address the objection, doesn't this make logic dependent on God's will? Could God make contradictions true? The answer is no, and here's why. In classical theology, particularly in Thomistic philosophy, God's will and his nature are not separate. God cannot act contrary to his nature. To ask, could God make contradictions true, is like asking, could God cease to be rational? It's not a limitation on God's power, it's a category confusion. Omnipotence means God can do all things that are logically possible. It doesn't mean God can perform logical impossibilities like making square circles or married bachelors. God's nature is the ground of logic itself. Furthermore, Turek must engage the question of modal logic and necessary truths. Logical laws are necessarily true in all possible worlds. But what grounds necessary truths? Why are they necessary rather than contingent? Atheistic materialism offers no answer. If matter is all that exists, and matter is contingent, it could have been arranged differently or not existed at all, then how do we get necessary truths? Only a necessarily existing being, a being whose non-existence is impossible, can ground necessary truths. This is God as understood in classical theism, the necessary being whose essence is existence, ipsum esse subsistens. Now, let's strengthen this with Christian Orthodox theology. First, emphasize the Logos doctrine from John chapter 1. The opening of John's Gospel deliberately echoes Genesis. In the beginning was the Logos. Logos means reason, word, rational principle. Christ is identified as the eternal Logos through whom all things were made. This isn't poetic language, it's profound metaphysics. The universe is intelligible because it was created by intelligence. Rationality pervades reality because reality itself proceeds from the Logos. Second, integrate the patristic understanding of divine simplicity and immutability. The Church Fathers, building on Scripture and Greek philosophy, recognize that God is not composite. He doesn't have parts that could be separated or changed. His attributes are not additions to his being, but are identical with his essence. God's rationality is not a feature he possesses, it's what he is. Therefore, logic, reflecting God's rational nature, is as eternal and unchanging as God himself. Third, connect this to the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. God didn't shape pre-existing chaotic matter into order, as ancient Greek philosophers imagined. He created all of reality from nothing by the Word, the Logos. This means both physical laws and logical laws originate from the same source, God's rational will. There's no gap between logic and physics because both are expressions of the Creator's mind. Now, logical fallacies Turek must avoid. First, don't commit the false dilemma. The choice isn't merely materialism or theism. There are other philosophical options: Platonic realism, neutral monism, pantheism. Turek should acknowledge these, but show why theism offers superior explanatory power. Platonism posits abstract objects with no causal explanation. Theism grounds them in God's nature and explains their connection to the physical world. Second, avoid the genetic fallacy. Just because materialism can't explain logical laws doesn't automatically prove theism. Turek must argue positively. Theism predicts immaterial logical laws grounded in a rational creator, and this prediction is confirmed by what we observe. Third, engage the objection that logic is just the structure of thought, not something in God's mind. The response: if logic is merely the structure of thought, why does the external world conform to it? Why does reality obey the same logical principles our minds use? The correspondence between logic in mind and logic in reality requires explanation. Theism provides it.
Both mind and world come from the same rational source. In summary, the laws of logic are real yet immaterial. They exist, govern all reasoning, but have no physical properties. This creates an insurmountable problem for materialism, which cannot account for immaterial realities. Theism, particularly Christian theism grounded in the Logos doctrine, offers a coherent explanation. Logic reflects God's rational nature, and both the universe and human minds participate in that rationality. Turek should press this argument more explicitly, engage Platonism's weaknesses, integrate divine simplicity, connect to creation ex nihilo, and avoid logical pitfalls. This makes the argument from logic philosophically rigorous and theologically profound.
Now we turn to a crucial practical skill in philosophical argumentation, spotting self-defeating claims. Frank Turek rightly emphasizes this because many atheistic and relativistic statements collapse under their own weight. But let's sharpen this tool and explore how to strengthen it philosophically and theologically. First, what is a self-defeating claim? It's a statement that, if true, would make itself false. It's a proposition that refutes itself by its own standard. The claim pulls the rug out from under its own feet. This is also called a performative contradiction or self-referential incoherence. Let's examine the classic examples Turek provides and deepen the analysis. Example 1. There is no truth. Ask, is that statement itself true? If yes, then there is at least one truth, namely that there is no truth, but that contradicts the claim. If no, if the statement isn't true, then we have no reason to believe it. Either way, the claim defeats itself. This isn't just clever wordplay, it's exposing logical incoherence. Turek should emphasize that this applies to popular variations. All truth is relative. There are no absolutes. You can't know anything for certain. Each refutes itself. If all truth is relative, is that statement relatively or absolutely true? If there are no absolutes, isn't that an absolute claim? If you can't know anything for certain, how do you know that for certain? Example 2. You shouldn't judge. But that statement itself is a moral judgment. It judges those who judge. It's self-defeating. The person saying, "Don't judge," is judging you for judging. They're doing the very thing they're condemning. Turek should clarify that Jesus never said, "Judge not that ye be not judged," in absolute terms. He said, "Judge not that ye be not judged," warning against hypocritical judgment, not righteous discernment. Immediately after, Jesus instructs his followers to judge correctly. Ye will know them by their fruits. Example 3. Science is the only way to know truth. This is scientism, not science. Ask, can that claim be proven scientifically? Can you run an experiment to demonstrate that science is the only way to know truth? No. The claim is philosophical, not scientific. Therefore, it refutes itself. If true, we couldn't know it's true because it can't be scientifically verified. Turek needs to press this harder. Scientism is rampant in contemporary culture, and many don't realize it's a philosophical, self-refuting position, not a scientific conclusion.
Now, how can Turek strengthen this argument with greater philosophical precision? First, distinguish between two types of self-defeat: logical self-defeat and pragmatic self-defeat. Logical self-defeat occurs when a statement's content contradicts its own assertion, like "there is no truth" or "all statements are false." The proposition is internally contradictory. Pragmatic self-defeat occurs when the act of asserting the claim contradicts its content, like saying, "I cannot speak a word of English in English," or "I don't exist." The performance refutes the proposition. Both are devastating, but recognizing the distinction helps clarify exactly why a claim fails. Second, Turek should engage the retorsion argument more explicitly. Retorsion is a classical philosophical technique where you show that denying a principle requires presupposing that very principle. For example, if someone denies the law of non-contradiction, their denial only makes sense if the law holds. If contradictions can both be true, then their statement, the law of non-contradiction is false, and its opposite, the law of non-contradiction is true, are both true simultaneously, which means their denial is meaningless. They've undercut their own argument. This is Aristotle's strategy in Metaphysics Book 4. He argued that anyone who tries to deny the law of non-contradiction must use it in their denial. It's inescapable. Third, Turek must address evolutionary epistemology's self-defeat more carefully. The claim is, our beliefs are evolutionary adaptations selected for survival, not truth. But then why trust that claim? If our cognitive faculties aren't reliable for truth, why believe the evolutionary story that leads to that conclusion? Alvin Plantinga formalized this as the evolutionary argument against naturalism. If naturalism and evolution are both true, we have a defeater for trusting our cognitive faculties. But if we can't trust our cognitive faculties, we can't trust the reasoning that led us to accept naturalism and evolution. The theory self-destructs. Turek should make this crystal clear. Evolutionary naturalism is self-refuting when applied to human rationality. Fourth, engage postmodernism's self-defeat. Postmodernism claims, all narratives are power plays. There's no objective truth, only perspectives shaped by culture and power. But is that claim itself just a power play? Or is it objectively true? If it's objectively true, postmodernism is false. There is at least one objective truth. If it's just a power play, why should we accept it? The postmodern critique applies to itself and collapses.
Now let's strengthen this with Christian Orthodox theology. First, emphasize that the law of non-contradiction isn't merely a logical rule, but reflects God's nature. God cannot deny himself, as Scripture affirms. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. God is truth, and truth cannot contradict itself. The law of non-contradiction is grounded in the character of God, who is eternally self-consistent. Second, integrate the doctrine of divine logos. John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Logos means word, reason, rationality. Christ is the eternal reason who makes coherent thought possible. Self-defeating claims are irrational because they violate the structure of reality established by the Logos. When someone makes a self-refuting statement, they're not merely committing a logical error. They're denying the rational order built into creation by God. Third, address the pastoral application. Spotting self-defeating claims isn't just intellectual gymnastics. It's helping people see that their worldview doesn't cohere. It's an act of love to gently show someone they're holding contradictory beliefs. Many people live with cognitive dissonance, affirming relativism on Monday and objective moral outrage on Tuesday. Exposing self-defeat can be the first step toward intellectual honesty and ultimately toward God. Now, logical fallacies Turek must avoid. First, don't commit the straw man fallacy. Make sure you're representing your opponent's position accurately before demonstrating its self-defeat. Misrepresenting an argument to make it easier to refute is intellectually dishonest and unconvincing. Second, avoid the tu quoque fallacy. You too. Just because someone else's position is self-defeating doesn't automatically prove yours is correct. Turek must offer a positive case for theism, not merely critique atheism. Third, be careful with scope. Not every claim that seems self-defeating actually is. For example, "I believe nothing I read" isn't strictly self-defeating unless the person is reading their own statement. Context matters. Precision is crucial. In summary, self-defeating claims are statements that refute themselves, either logically or pragmatically. Classic examples include "there is no truth," "you shouldn't judge," and "science is the only way to know truth." Strengthening this argument requires distinguishing types of self-defeat, employing rhetorician, addressing evolutionary epistemology and postmodernism, and grounding rationality in the logos. Turek should integrate Christian theology, apply this tool pastorally, and avoid logical pitfalls. This makes the argument not just clever, but philosophically rigorous and theologically profound. It's a powerful tool for clearing away intellectual debris so people can see reality more clearly. Next, we'll move to slide 20, where we'll examine whether matter alone can ground reason by comparing materialist and theistic worldviews on the nature of mind and rationality. Today, we delve into a crucial comparison. Can matter alone ground reason? In this slide, we contrast the materialist and theistic worldviews on the nature of mind and rationality. Firstly, the materialist perspective claims that the mind is purely physical brain activity, nothing more than neurons firing due to physics and chemistry. Here lies the insurmountable issue. If thoughts are merely physical brain states caused by prior physical states, they are determined by physics, not logic or evidence. Now consider this. If our belief that 2 + 2 = 4 is held not because it is true, but simply due to certain neurons firing in a specific pattern, dictated by physical causes, trust in that belief is inherently undermined. Physical causation doesn't regard truth, severing the link between belief and truth. Turek should amplify this point. Materialism explains why we believe, but not whether we should believe, leaving the validity of arguments, including arguments for materialism, in question. Moreover, materialism suggests logic is merely an evolved survival convention, yet logical laws are universal and necessary, not contingent like evolutionary adaptations. Evolution selects for survival, not truth. An organism might survive with false beliefs so long as they yield survival benefits. Thus, if our cognitive faculties aim solely at survival, trusting them for truth, especially in matters abstract like logic and theology, is without warrant.
Theism claims that mind precedes matter. God is the eternal, rational mind who created both the physical universe and rational, finite minds. Immaterial souls exist, made in God's image, capable of grasping immaterial truths like logical laws. Logic reflects God's nature, and human reason participates in divine rationality. This worldview offers a coherent explanation for everything materialism struggles with. Why do immaterial logical laws exist and govern reality? Because they reflect the rational nature of the Creator. Why can human minds grasp these laws? Because we're made in the image of the Logos, the divine reason through whom all things were made. Why does our reasoning track truth rather than merely survival? Because a truthful God designed our cognitive faculties to correspond with reality. Theism should emphasize the explanatory superiority of its worldview. It's not merely that materialism fails to explain reason and theism succeeds. It's that theism predicts what we observe. If God is rational and created both world and minds, we should expect the world to be rationally ordered and minds to be capable of understanding that order. And that's precisely what we find. The correspondence between mind and world isn't a happy accident. It's built into the fabric of creation. First, distinguish between reductive and non-reductive materialism. Reductive materialism claims mental states are identical to brain states. There's nothing to mind except physical processes. Non-reductive materialism claims mental states supervene on brain states. They're distinct but wholly dependent on physical processes. Both fail to ground rationality. Reductive materialism faces the problem we've already discussed. If thoughts are just brain states, they're caused by physics, not justified by reasons. Not reductive materialism fares no better. If mental states are wholly dependent on physical states, they're still ultimately determined by non-rational physical causes, severing the link between belief and truth. Second, engage the hard problem of consciousness more explicitly. Philosopher David Chalmers distinguishes between the easy problems of consciousness, explaining cognitive functions like perception, memory, attention, and the hard problem, explaining subjective experience itself, the what-it's-like quality of consciousness. Materialism might explain brain functions, but it cannot explain why there's something it's like to be conscious. Why does subjective experience exist at all? Why isn't the brain just a sophisticated unconscious information processor? Theism offers an answer. Consciousness reflects our creation in the image of a conscious God. We're not merely material machines, but ensouled beings with immaterial dimensions.
Let's begin with enhancing the argument using Christian Orthodox theology. First, we'll emphasize the doctrine of imago Dei, humans created in God's image. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it's written, "God created man in his own image." This refers not to physical resemblance, but to our rational, moral, and relational capacities. We uniquely bear God's image, especially in our rationality, our ability to think logically, grasp truth, and reason beyond mere survival. Humans, unlike any other creatures, engage in philosophy, mathematics, theology, and science. We're meant to think God's thoughts after him. Next, we'll delve into the Logos doctrine. John chapter 1 verse 3 states, "All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made." Here, the Logos, Christ as divine reason, is not merely an abstract principle, but a personal being. This means rationality itself isn't impersonal, it's grounded in a rational person. Thus, both the objective existence of logical laws and the personal nature of human rationality are founded on Christ, who is reason himself. Continuing, we'll explore Aquinas' philosophy of the soul and intellect. Aquinas posited that the human soul is the form of the body, animating and organizing matter, but not reducible to it. The intellect part of the soul has immaterial operations. When we understand universal concepts such as triangularity or justice, we perform acts that transcend material restrictions. This demonstrates the immaterial capacities of the human soul, proving that we are more than just matter. Now, let's discuss the logical fallacies Turek should avoid. Firstly, the false dichotomy. We mustn't reduce our choices to reductive materialism or theism alone. Other positions exist: property dualism, panpsychism, idealism. Turek should acknowledge these alternatives but argue that theism provides superior explanatory power. While property dualism admits immaterial properties, it doesn't explain their existence or correspondence to reality, which theism grounds in God's creative act. Next, Turek must avoid overstating his conclusions. The argument from reason supports generic theism, suggesting a rational creator rather than specifically Christian doctrine. While Christianity ultimately offers the fullest explanation, Turek should clarify that this particular argument doesn't fully encompass it. Also, when addressing objections, especially regarding how God's immaterial thoughts influence physical reality, it's crucial to note that God, as creator, operates beyond creature limitations. Divine causation is singular and not constrained as we experience causation. The incarnation uniquely demonstrates the union of immaterial and material without contradiction. In sum, materialism fails to ground reason because it reduces thoughts to non-rational physical grain states, losing the connection between belief and truth. It cannot account for immaterial logical laws or consciousness and undercuts trust in abstract truths relevant to survival. Theism, however, coherently explains all of this. Logic reflects God's eternal nature, our minds are made in His image, and reasoning effectively tracks truth given both the world and our intellects derive from the same divine source. Thus, Turek should articulate these distinctions in materialism, address the hard problem of consciousness, integrate Imago Dei and Logos theology, reference Aquinas, and avoid logical pitfalls. Refining the argument this way ensures its philosophical rigor and theological depth, revealing that only theism can support the rationality necessary to challenge it.
Now we examine a particularly powerful argument, the limits of evolutionary explanations for reason. Frank Turek touches on this, but we need to engage Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism more thoroughly to demonstrate just how devastating it is for atheistic materialism. First, let's understand the core claim. Evolution by natural selection operates through one primary mechanism: differential survival and reproduction. Organisms with traits that enhance survival and reproduction tend to pass those traits to offspring. Over time, populations evolve adaptations that increase fitness, the ability to survive and reproduce in a given environment. Notice what's being selected: not truth, but survival advantage. Now here's the crucial question. Does evolution select for true beliefs? The answer is no, at least not necessarily. Evolution selects for adaptive behavior. An organism can survive and reproduce perfectly well with false beliefs as long as those beliefs produce behaviors that enhance survival. Consider a simple example from philosopher Patricia Churchland. Boiled down to essentials, a nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. The principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. Truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. In other words, evolution cares about survival, not truth. If a false belief produces survival-enhancing behavior, evolution will favor it just as much as a true belief that produces the same behavior. Now, let's formalize Plantinga's argument. It runs like this. Premise 1. If naturalism and evolution are both true, then our cognitive faculties were produced by unguided evolutionary processes aimed solely at survival and reproduction, not at truth. Premise 2. If our cognitive faculties are aimed at survival rather than truth, then the probability that they reliably produce true beliefs is low or inscrutable. Why? Because, as we've seen, false beliefs can be just as adaptive as true ones. Premise 3. But if the probability that our cognitive faculties reliably produce true beliefs is low or inscrutable, then we have a defeater for trusting our cognitive faculties. A defeater is a reason to doubt a belief. If you can't trust your cognitive faculties, you can't trust any belief they produce. Conclusion. Therefore, if naturalism and evolution are both true, we have a defeater for trusting our cognitive faculties. But that means we can't trust the reasoning that led us to believe naturalism and evolution in the first place. The theory undercuts itself. It's self-refuting.
Now, let's address the most common objections to our argument critically. Objection 1 states that true beliefs about the environment have survival value, so evolution would select for truth-tracking minds. Initially, this seems plausible, but upon closer inspection, it lacks depth. While true beliefs are beneficial when considering immediate survival scenarios, identifying predators, recognizing safe water, and avoiding fire, they are quite limited. The vast majority of our reasoning extends well beyond mere survival. It traverses abstract mathematics, philosophical reasoning, theological discussions, scientific theories, moral imperatives, and logical structures, areas with no direct survival relevance. It's questionable whether evolution would select for reliable faculties in these complex domains. Moreover, if we doubt these faculties, why should we trust them at all, even in reasoning about evolution? Moving on to objection 2, which posits, cognitive faculties that track truth generally are more adaptive than those that don't. This assumption requires proof, not mere acceptance. For instance, a species might operate on wholly incorrect beliefs, but pair them with instinctual behaviors that ensure survival. Like a creature believing predators are delightful, yet feels a strong urge to flee such delight. Here, behavior matters more than the truth underlying the belief. Evolution is indifferent to whether we're in a world of mostly true beliefs or one where falsehood, paired cleverly with adaptive action, prevails. Finally, consider objection 3. We can test our beliefs and correct errors. Thus, even without selective evolution for truth, we've developed methodologies, science, logic, that correct evolutionary limits. This presumes reliable cognitive faculties to perform such testing. Should these faculties themselves prove untrustworthy, any corrections are inherently flawed. One cannot depend on an unreliable tool to self-correct. The very principles of logic and evidence are themselves constructs of these faculties. If these standards are suspect, our entire evaluative process is cast into doubt.
Now, let's strengthen this with Christian Orthodox theology and show why theism avoids these problems entirely. First, the doctrine of Imago Dei, humans made in God's image, provides exactly what evolutionary naturalism lacks, a reason to trust our cognitive faculties for truth, not merely survival. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. God created man in his own image. This includes rationality. We're designed to think God's thoughts after him, to apprehend truth because God is truth. Our minds are calibrated to reality because the same Logos who made reality also made our minds. There's a built-in correspondence. Second, the concept of divine providence and sustaining creation. God doesn't merely create and walk away. Colossians chapter 1 verse 17, in him all things hold together. This includes the reliable functioning of human cognitive faculties. God sustains the order that makes reasoning possible. Theism predicts reliable cognitive faculties. Naturalism cannot. Third, integrate the teleological understanding of human nature from Aquinas and Aristotle. Human beings have a telos, an end or purpose, which includes knowing truth and communing with God. Our rational faculties are ordered toward truth by design, not by accident. This is why humans alone, among all creatures, pursue knowledge for its own sake, not merely for survival advantage. We study astronomy, philosophy, and theology, disciplines with no survival payoff because we're designed for truth-seeking. Now, Turek must clarify the scope and force of this argument. First, the argument doesn't claim evolution is false or that natural selection doesn't occur. It claims that if naturalism is true and evolution is the sole explanation for cognitive faculties, then we can't trust those faculties. The combination of naturalism plus evolution is self-defeating. Theistic evolution, by contrast, doesn't face this problem because God could use evolutionary processes as a means to create rational creatures designed for truth. Second, the argument doesn't claim atheists can't reason or that they're irrational. Clearly, they can reason, often brilliantly. The claim is that atheistic naturalism cannot account for the reliability of reasoning. Atheists can reason because they're made in God's image, whether they acknowledge it or not. They're borrowing capital from the theistic worldview. Third, Turek should address the pragmatic response. Maybe we can't justify trusting our faculties on naturalism, but we have no choice but to use them anyway. True, but this concedes the argument. It admits naturalism is rationally incoherent. We can live as though our faculties are reliable, but naturalism gives us no reason to believe they actually are. This is intellectual bankruptcy. Finally, Turek must avoid the genetic fallacy. The argument isn't, evolution produced our faculties, therefore they're unreliable. The argument is, if naturalism is true, evolution aimed solely at survival, not truth, then we have no reason to think our faculties reliably track truth. It's not about origin per se, but about whether the origin provides grounds for reliability. In summary, evolution selects for adaptive behavior, not true beliefs. False beliefs can be just as adaptive as true ones. Therefore, if naturalism and evolution are both true, we have no reason to trust our cognitive faculties. But if we can't trust our cognitive faculties, we can't trust the reasoning that leads to naturalism. The theory self-destructs. Theism, by contrast, provides a coherent explanation. We're made in God's image, designed for truth-seeking, sustained by divine providence. Turek should engage Plantinga's argument rigorously, address objections carefully, integrate imago Dei and teleological anthropology, clarify scope, and avoid fallacies. This makes the evolutionary argument against naturalism one of the most powerful tools in the apologist's arsenal, showing that atheism cannot even account for the rationality needed to argue for atheism. Next, we'll move to slide 22, where we'll see how theism uniquely grounds both the laws of logic and rational minds, tying together the arguments from reason to a comprehensive case for God as the foundation of rationality itself.
Now we arrive at the culmination of Chapter 2 on reason. Theism uniquely grounds both the laws of logic and rational minds. Frank Turek presents this conclusion effectively, but let's synthesize all the arguments we've examined and show how they converge into a comprehensive case that only theism can adequately explain rationality itself. This is the capstone argument, showing that atheism cannot even account for the reasoning needed to argue against God. First, let's recap what we've established. We've seen that the laws of logic are real yet immaterial. They exist, govern all rational thought, but have no physical properties. They're universal, necessary, and unchanging. They applied before humans evolved and would remain true even if all minds ceased to exist. Materialism cannot explain how immaterial laws can exist if only material things are real. We've also seen that reasoning itself requires grounding that materialism cannot provide. If thoughts are merely physical brain states caused by prior physical states according to the laws of physics and chemistry, then beliefs are determined by non-rational causes, not justified by reasons. This severs the connection between belief and truth. Furthermore, evolutionary naturalism faces a devastating self-defeat. If our cognitive faculties are products of unguided evolution aimed solely at survival rather than truth, we have no reason to trust them for truth, especially regarding abstract matters like logic, mathematics, and philosophy. But if we can't trust our cognitive faculties, we can't trust the reasoning that led to naturalism itself. Now, here's where Turek needs to synthesize these arguments more explicitly into a unified case for theism. The question is, what worldview can coherently account for both immaterial logical laws and reliable rational minds? The answer, only theism, particularly classical Christian theism grounded in the Logos doctrine. Let's see why. First, theism explains the existence of immaterial logical laws. They're not free-floating abstract objects with no explanation, as Platonism suggests. They're not merely human conventions or evolutionary adaptations, as naturalism claims. Rather, they reflect the rational nature of God himself. God is logos, eternal reason. Logic isn't something external that God obeys. It flows from his essence. The law of non-contradiction holds because God cannot deny himself. The law of identity holds because God is eternally self-consistent.
These laws are necessary truths because they're grounded in the necessary being whose essence is existence, God as ipsum esse subsistens.
Second, theism explains the existence of rational minds capable of grasping immaterial truths. Humans are made in God's image, imago Dei. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. God created man in his own image. This includes our rationality. We're designed to think God's thoughts after him, to apprehend truth because God is truth. Our cognitive faculties are calibrated for truth-seeking, not merely survival, because they are created by a truthful God who desires a relationship with rational creatures. Third, and this is crucial, theism explains the correspondence between logical laws and rational minds, between the structure of reality and the structure of thought. Why does the world obey logical principles? Why can human minds grasp those principles? On naturalism, this correspondence is a cosmic accident, an unexplained brute fact. On theism, it's built into the fabric of creation. The same Logos who made the world also made our minds. Reality is rational because it proceeds from divine reason. Minds can grasp that rationality because they're made in the image of the Logos. There's a built-in harmony. This is what John chapter 1 articulates. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. All things were made through him. The universe is intelligible because it was created by intelligence. Rationality pervades reality because reality itself proceeds from the Logos. Fourth, theism explains the normativity of logic, why we ought to think logically, why violating logical principles is not merely ineffective but wrong. If logic is just a description of how brains happen to work due to evolutionary accident, there's no should involved, just is. But we recognize that reasoning correctly is normative, not merely pragmatic. We ought to avoid contradictions, ought to follow valid inferences, ought to proportion belief to evidence. This normativity makes sense if logic reflects God's nature and we're designed to conform to it. Fifth, theism grounds the reliability of cognitive faculties through divine providence. God doesn't merely create and walk away, he sustains creation continuously. Colossians chapter 1, verse 17, in him all things hold together. This includes the reliable functioning of natural laws and human cognitive capacities. Our reasoning faculties work because God sustains them in their proper function. This isn't deism, it's continuous divine conservation of the order that makes rationality possible.
Now, let's strengthen this synthesis with deeper Christian Orthodox theology. First, we emphasize divine simplicity more explicitly. In classical theism, God is not composite. His attributes are not separate qualities added to his being, but are unified in his simple essence. God's rationality, truthfulness, goodness, and power are not distinct features, but aspects of the single divine nature. Therefore, when we say logic reflects God's nature, we're not saying God has logic as a property. Rather, God is the rational foundation of all reality. This grounds logic more deeply than any alternative. Next, we integrate the patristic understanding of participation. The Church Fathers, particularly those influenced by Platonism but correcting it through biblical theology, taught that created things participate in divine attributes without being identical to God. Our rationality participates in God's rationality. Logical truths in our minds participate in the eternal Logos. This explains both the similarity, we can think truly, and the difference, where finite, God is infinite. We grasp truth partially, God is truth fully. Furthermore, connect this to the doctrine of divine illumination from Augustine. Augustine argued that just as physical light makes visible objects perceptible to the eye, divine intellectual light makes intelligible truths accessible to the mind. We don't create logical truths or mathematical principles. We discover them through a kind of intellectual illumination provided by God. This isn't mysticism. It's a philosophical account of how finite minds access necessary truths. Also, engage Aquinas' philosophy of participated being. Aquinas taught that creatures have existence, but are not identical to existence. They participate in being. God alone is being itself, ipsum esse subsistens. Similarly, creatures have rationality, but are not rationality itself. They participate in the divine logos. This provides a coherent metaphysical framework for understanding how finite minds relate to infinite reason. Now, Turek must address potential objections to avoid weaknesses. Objection 1. This makes logic dependent on God's will. Could God change logic? The response: logic doesn't depend on God's will in the sense of arbitrary choice. It depends on God's nature, which is unchanging. God cannot act contrary to his nature. God cannot make contradictions true because that would require him to deny himself, which is impossible given his immutable nature. Objection 2. If logic reflects God's nature, how can atheists reason? The response: atheists can reason because they're made in God's image, whether they acknowledge it or not. The argument isn't that atheists are incapable of rationality, but that atheism as a worldview cannot account for rationality. Atheists borrow from the theistic framework whenever they think logically. Objection 3. Couldn't logic just be brute facts requiring no explanation? This violates the principle of sufficient reason. Contingent facts require explanation. Even if logical laws were eternal, their specific content, why these laws rather than others or none, requires grounding. Only a necessary being can serve as the ultimate explanation for necessary truths. In summary, theism uniquely grounds both the laws of logic and rational minds. Logic reflects God's nature as logos. Minds are made in God's image, designed for truth-seeking. The correspondence between logical structure and mental structure is built into creation by the same divine reason who made both. The normativity of logic flows from conforming to divine nature. The reliability of cognitive faculties is sustained by divine providence. Materialism cannot account for any of this. Naturalism self-destructs when applied to rationality itself. Only Christian theism, grounded in the Logos doctrine, provides a coherent, comprehensive explanation for the very reasoning processes we use to evaluate competing worldviews. Turek should synthesize these arguments explicitly, integrate divine simplicity and participation, engage Augustine and Aquinas, and address objections carefully. This makes the argument from reason not merely persuasive, but philosophically devastating, showing that atheism is rationally incoherent at its foundation.